You're listening to Informed America Radio, pushing back the frontiers of ignorance 24/7. Now, the Teri O'Brien Show.
May I have your attention, please?
Here we go. Y'all ready?
It's not about being right in the ideological sense of the word. It's about committing common sense every single day. It's politics, it's pop culture, and it's the news of the day, both serious stuff and the water cooler stuff. I've never seen such a bunch of petty, bitter, mean-spirited, vindictive people. And I'm really glad, Democrats, I'm really glad that all the problems, all the serious problems in our country are solved now. And we can focus on being vindictive over this guy who's going to be ambassador to Belgium. That's like the most important problem we have facing our country right now. Way to go, Democrats. This is what I'm saying. My work is never done. We don't need to investigate the motive. As sad as this is, when you put on the red suspenders.
Put on a uniform.
Yeah, you put on the big shoes, you put on the white face and the red nose and the red makeup, the wig, that crazy-looking wig, and you go out there and flop around with the big shoes. I'm sorry, I don't want to see anybody hurt, but I have to say, you're an intimidating and frightening presence in the community at that point. And some might say that without even knowing it, you're actually asking for it because you are dressed up as a clown. One thing we always say is the Second Amendment is not about hunting. The Second Amendment is about the right to keep and bear arms to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical. That's what it's about. It's not about being able to go out and shoot bunny rabbit.
Ooh, what a girl. She's always in a whirl.
Always going new places, seeing new faces. That girl on the go.
Teri O'Brien.
Wonderful girl on the go.
Hey, 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 welcome one, welcome all to this June 28th, 2015 edition of the Teri O'Brien Show. If you're listening from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on this lovely Sunday, June 28th, you can join the live and lively chat room at TeriO'Brien.com, TeriO'Brien.com. I'm there. Hope you're there too, but maybe you're listening on demand, which you can also do at TeriO'Brien.com, where the show never ends. Also listen on demand at Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Red State Talk Radio, and lots of other places too. So thanks for joining us today. We've got a lot coming up as always. We've got our takeaways of the week and including my thoughts about the Supreme Court cases that have come down. You're all well aware of the so-called same-sex marriage case. We're going to get into that and some thoughts. And also the King v. Burwell, the Obamacare case. We'll get into that. But there's another case that's getting very little attention, and it could be as transformative as Obamacare, because it helps to facilitate something that the Obama regime has been cooking up on the down low for 5 years, which will dramatically transform this country if it's not stopped. And it's designed to destroy the suburbs by taking their tax money and funneling it into community organizing groups and inner cities, and also by forcing inner city residents into suburbs and vice versa, by taking over local governments and their zoning power. It's a complete federal power grab designed to do social engineering and to facilitate something that Obama has been dreaming of his entire adult life. And it's really dangerous. And the funny thing is, you haven't heard anything about it. Oh, maybe that's not so funny. Maybe that's sort of by design. In fact, the people pushing this have admitted on tape that it's by design. And the guy who discovered it is, of course, a guy who has been writing about this subject for many years, our friend Stanley Kurtz of National Review, who's going to join us later to talk about Obama's secret plan to destroy the suburbs, who's doing it, how they're doing it, where they've done it already, and what you can do to stop it from coming to your neighborhood. But let's get into our takeaways of the week. I've got my list of takeaways of the week here. Let's get into those before anything else. And I'll just list them, no particular order. The Supreme Court is out of control, and it's about time we do something about it. Senator Ted Cruz has an idea what we can do, and that is have retention elections. Every 2 presidential elections, Senator Cruz wants to have a retention election for Supreme Court justices. And he writes about this in a National Review op-ed that, of course, I will link to in the show notes. You guys know that if you go to TeriO'Brien.com, we always put show notes every week that have links to all the things we talk about. And so you don't have to look any of this stuff up. It's all right there as a resource because this show exists to give you the information that is below the surface, below the superficial, so that you'll have the knowledge and information you need to be a genuinely informed citizen and also to inform your fellow citizens. That's what we're all about. So thanks to those of you who support our mission in any way you can, either by going and starting your Amazon.com shopping at TeriO'Brien.com. If you do that, that helps the show stay on the air because you get the same great customer service and selection and prices that Amazon is famous for. And I buy everything from Amazon. But also, you pay no more, but they kick a few pennies back to us if you do that. So it helps us keep the show on the air. Other things that help, posting about the show on your social networks, posting comments at TeriO'Brien.com, and of course, our real angels. And the only reason we're still here, and if we have any hope of staying here, it's going to be because of those of you who either subscribe to the show by making a monthly gift, and that can be $5 a month. That helps. Those of you who are $5 a month subscribers, that makes all the difference. Or if you choose, you can make a one-time contribution. Some of you have been very generous in doing that, and that has kept us on the air. And if you do that, of course, you get special show notes, subscriber show notes, and you get version of the show every week with no commercial breaks. So that's kind of fun. But anyway, that's takeaway number 1. The Supreme Court is out of control. Number 2, Barack Obama is determined to be even more lawless and radical in what he calls the fourth quarter than we even imagined. And it's pretty terrifying. And I don't know if you saw or listened to, but you probably heard about the interview that Obama did with the comedian Mark Maron. And the reason you heard about it, of course, is because he used the N-word. And that was, the big takeaway from the interview. But what I thought was equally interesting is how he spoke about being fearless now. And he promised us, I don't know if you remember, right after he was elected, he promised us he was going to be more radical in his second term. And that's all coming true. I mean, once again, Barack Obama has never really concealed who he was. The accomplice media attempted very well to conceal who he was from low information, emotionally driven voters, people who get their news, so-called, from either entertainment programs or what are laughingly called news programs like network news or even cable news. They didn't report. But most of you and anyone who dared to do a little digging knew who this man was and knew he vowed to destroy the coal industry and that he considered people who wanted to exercise their Second Amendment rights as some sort of mouth-breathing bitter clingers, that he had no love for the Constitution. In fact, he has contempt for this document of so-called negative liberties, which is precisely what the founders wanted and what he despises. And so, that was all well known, predictable. And earlier in the week, I tweeted and I got several good retweets on this, that watching what is happening now in this end of his second term where he promised to be more radical, it's very difficult for me not to have loathing and contempt for people who actually voted for this man, the first or the second time. Some of my friends said, well, the second time was really inexcusable. Both times were inexcusable because everything that he was and is was well known even before he ran for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. So that's the second thing. Let's see. Despite Roberts' best efforts, and by the way, I'm reading from just things I tap into my tablet here during the week. Despite Justice John Roberts' best efforts to save it, not once but twice, the so-called Affordable Care Act is not affordable. It's not about care, and it's not sustainable. We just learned last week that an insurance company called Assurant is getting out of the insurance market. And I think they primarily do their health insurance thing in California. But they're completely getting out of the market because they lost $84 million in the first 3 months of this year. And it's not sustainable. And that's pretty much a microcosm for the whole thing. None of this is sustainable. And all of these companies are going to be going down the drain. So the Affordable Care Act, this could be a temporary fix, but it's not going to be sustainable over the long term because really it's not insurance, as we have said from the beginning, from before this heinous scheme was ever enacted. I have said if you eliminate the requirement that insurance companies not insure what are called pre-existing conditions, then you eliminate the whole concept of underwriting and medical risk, taking a risk, actuarial determination of what risk they can afford to take at what premium. Basically, if you eliminate all that, it's income redistribution. It's no longer insurance, and that's where we are. And as Margaret Thatcher famously said, the trouble with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money, and therefore that's where we are. So despite those efforts, that's not sustainable. Next takeaway of the week, not only is the gay Gestapo not going to be satisfied with their Supreme Court victory, they are hell-bent on annihilating traditional society. And like the rest of the left, they have been lying to us about their intentions. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a moment. But they've been lying when they say they just want marriage equality, that they're not trying to redefine marriage, that they're not trying to destroy the traditional family. When they say that, that's a lie, because that is their intention. And behind closed doors, they tell the truth about their scheming. And so they're all like the rest of the left, right? They just lie. And we're going to talk in the program as it unfolds about how we got to this point. But let me share with you, I got to go back and find this article, a very interesting article from the Weekly Standard. Now, heck, where did I put it? I've got so many things here in my pile. Let me see if I can find that. Ah, yes, here it is. An article from the Weekly Standard dated June 22nd by Jonathan Last. You will be assimilated. The same-sex marriage, bait and switch. And he begins by reminding us about Brendan Eich. And if you don't remember who that is, we did write about him at terryobrien.com, but you will remember he was the co-founder and CEO of Mozilla, the company that created the Firefox web browser and a number of other open source pieces of software that many of us use. And he was dismissed from his company in 2014 when it was discovered that he had 6 years earlier, keep this in mind, donated $1,000 to California's Proposition 8 campaign. And that was a ballot initiative that passed in California. It passed with a higher percentage of the vote than Barack Obama received in California in 2012. And so this guy donated, exercised his rights to support a political cause. Nobody alleged that this guy ever did anything mean to anyone. Everyone said this guy treated everybody with respect. But what Jonathan Last points out in this piece from the Weekly Standard that is really interesting is what has happened since then. So remember, this was a year ago, and he was fired. So Last writes, a year after Ike's firing, for instance, Hampton Caitlin, a Silicon Valley programmer who was one of the first to demand Ike's resignation, took to Twitter to bait Ike. And on April 2nd, he wrote, it had been a couple weeks since I had gotten some sort of Brendan Ike-related hate mail. How are things going over there on your side, Brendan? And this man who was fired simply for donating $1,000 to support a political cause he wanted to support, wrote back on Twitter, you demanded I be completely removed from any day-to-day activities at Mozilla, and got your wish. I'm still unemployed. How are you? To which this member of the gay Gestapo, this Hampton Caitlin, replied, Brendan Ike, married and able to live in the USA and working together on open source stuff in like a loving, happy, gay, married way. And that was on April 2nd. So you can see that it shows that these proponents of so-called same-sex marriage are not just really interested in live and let live, marriage equality. No. That's not. This is all about, as Obama might say, punishment, right? Punish those who disagree with you. And the ambitions of this movement go very, very far, and it's very frightening to see how far it goes, because as Mr. Last points out here in the Weekly Standard, this is a bait and switch. You know, these people claim one thing, but really that's not what they claim at all. He also points out that one thing that is at the heart of this whole deception right at the beginning is the whole idea of how many Americans are homosexuals. For years, these activists have pushed the idea that 10% of the population is homosexual. There was no evidence for that anywhere. It's like man-caused climate change. There's no evidence, but they just pulled this out of a very dark place. Being homosexual, it's probably easier to get there, I'm thinking. But they were able to propagandize, and they had the media. And we've talked on this program about this well-orchestrated campaign that was described back in the late 80s by two authors. One was a psychologist, and they talked about how they were going to use the popular culture to normalize and mainstream homosexuality. And they wrote a book about it. It started out as an article, eventually became a book called After the Ball. And we will put this in the show notes. I wrote a piece about it. I will also put that in the show notes so you can read about how they had this well-orchestrated plan. And that was part of it, make people think like, oh my God, it's your neighbor. He's a homosexual. It's the person in the next cubicle. Well, maybe. But really, it turns out that according to a 2014 study from the Centers for Disease Control, with a big sample, over 34,000 people, it found that 96.6% of Americans identified as heterosexual. 1.6% identified as homosexual. So, let's say 2%. That's very different from 10%. So, that's the first thing, the dishonesty there. Now, another thing that we've been told, as if this makes any difference, that homosexuality is genetic. That somehow, quote unquote, you're born this way. As if that means we should normalize and mainstream behavior that, frankly, many people consider quite deviant. There's other things that are genetic. We don't say, for example, I think now know that the propensity to become addicted to drugs and alcohol is genetic. We don't say, okay, Mr. Alcoholic, you were born that way, so we're going to celebrate your illness, which is what it's called. We don't say that. It's genetic, though. So the argument has always been made, well, they're born this way, they can't help this propensity. okay, but that doesn't mean we should mainstream it. But these folks in the gay activist community are starting to say that's not really true. They're starting to say, you know what? Sexual orientation is not really genetically determined. Mr. Last, in his piece here, quotes a guy named Alexander Berinsky in some avant-garde web zine, arguing that sexuality is a characteristic to be actively constructed by the self. Oh, hello, Caitlyn Jenner. It's kind of like race, Rachel Donzel. You can, it's whatever you identify as. He was talking about the fact that it's time for, this is a different person. In the New Republic in January 2014, Brandon Ambrosino attacked the idea of sexual orientation being genetically determined. It's time for the LGBT community to start moving beyond genetic predisposition as a tool for gaining mainstream acceptance of gay rights. So basically, they basically just said this all this time because it was useful. He goes on, for decades now, it's been the most powerful argument in the LGBT arsenal that we were born this way. Still, as compelling as these arguments are, they may have outgrown their usefulness. While most Americans now in favor of gay marriage, it's time for the argument to shift to one where genetics don't matter. The genetic argument has boxed us into a corner. So, the next thing he talks about, and we're getting close to the break, but I think I have time to get to this, the idea that the right to so-called same-sex marriage might weaken the institution of marriage itself. And apparently, not just the genetic argument, that tool, we don't need that anymore. That's out the window. Now, we don't need to make the argument or argue whether or not same-sex marriage weakens marriage. Because, in fact, now some of these folks are saying that homosexual couples are not monogamous. About half of them are not monogamous. According to a 2013 study cited in the Daily Beast by this gay activist, Jay Michelson, he says about half of gay marriages surveyed were not strictly monogamous. And so the idea is that this non-monogamy in the homosexual community, which involves extramarital relationships, is great because this whole thing can spread from the homosexual community and their marriages into heterosexual marriages. And we can have open marriages and non-monogamy. And in fact, this woman in Slate named Hannah Rosen agrees. And she thinks that same-sex marriage won't just change normal marriage by allowing for more of these relationships. She thinks that's a good thing. So we'll get into that and my reaction to the decision in the same-sex marriage case. And also, we are going to get into that whole thing about the Obama regime trying to destroy the suburbs and what you can do about it on the other side here on the Teri O'Brien Show.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U.
Here's what insightful and gifted writer Ginny DeAngelis of American Thinker and Breitbart fame says about Teri O'Brien's book, The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America. In the book, The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America, Teri O'Brien illustrates her brilliance. This lady uses sarcasm like a sword and cuts through the absurdity of America being forced to endure the A to Z disaster who, when he's not on vacation, lives in the White House. The well-researched information doesn't miss one iota of what's gone on for the past 6+ years. Teri weaves hard-hitting facts together with snarkiness and humor. You'll find yourself laughing. Then, as you're giggling, you'll begin to realize that what seemed comical is actually pathetic. Only from Teri could you get a statement like this. Election day, unemployment was 7.9%, which sounded bad to some people, but that didn't matter. It was no match for the awesome power of Barack Obama's radiant, loving energy and his amazing ability to care so much about people, especially the downtrodden, that they could literally feel his long arms warmly hugging them as they watched Judge Judy every afternoon. Read The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America. Trust me, learning the hard truth will be very entertaining. Another reviewer writes, "This book was great fun to read and was especially valuable for the links to news reports on each of the topics covered. The fun part stops when you realize what a cumulative disaster Obama's term in office has been. Much of it documented in this book. What say you? Get your copy of The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America on Amazon.com today for the amazing price of only 99 cents. And let us know what you think by writing to abcs@terryobrien.com or posting your review on Amazon. Thank you for your encouragement and support."
Now I know my ABCs. Aren't you very proud of me?
Broadcasting from a secured bunker in an undisclosed location in flyover country, outside the East Coast bubble and far from left coast insanity. You're listening to America's original warrior princess, Teri O'Brien. Learn more at terryobrien.com.
If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Thomas Jefferson. You're listening to Informed America Radio.
Teri's book, The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America, is available on Amazon.com, Smashwords.com, and the iBook store. Get yours today.
She's like a fist inside a velvet glove, softly shattering left-wing stupidity. The Teri O'Brien Show, proud member of the Red State Talk Radio Network.
Red State Talk Radio.
The Talk Monster.
Judge Kennedy is what many in recent weeks have referred to as a true conservative, one who believes that our constitutional system is one of enumerated powers, that it is we, the people, who have granted certain rights to the government, not the other way around, and that unless the Constitution grants a power to the federal government or restricts a state's exercise of that power, it remains with the states or the people.
Ronald Reagan from November 1987, as he announced his nomination of Anthony Kennedy, the third choice, by the way, for the vacant Supreme Court seat here on the Teri O'Brien Show. Anthony Kennedy was, of course, the third choice after Robert Bork. The magnificent Robert Bork had been demonized and marginalized by the late Senator Ted Kennedy. Another great thing he did for our country. You know, I know some of you saw on my Twitter feed that when people were talking about the new $10 bill and how we need to put a woman on the $10 bill, which is more stupidity as far as I'm concerned. But if we're going to do it, let's make it Mary Jo Kopechne, because she kept Ted Kennedy from becoming president. But he still was able to do a lot of damage, not only, as we've discussed frequently on the show, in the area of immigration, which we're paying for today, but also Anthony Kennedy, because he terrorized Bork and demonized him and did the whole Alinskyite thing on him. And then, of course, the next guy, Ginsburg, was revealed to have smoked dope, which now that's, you know, a resume enhancement. But back then it was considered very negative. So they go to Anthony Kennedy, and I'm actually going to share some information about him when we get into talking about the decision. But back to this piece from the Weekly Standard that I was talking about, called You Will Be Assimilated, talking about the fact that the gay Gestapo as they promulgated their agenda. And be very clear, this whole thing about the so-called same-sex marriage, it's not about marriage equality. It's not about love. I mean, to some degree, it is about adult desires. It's certainly not about children, which we're going to talk about what's good for them, which is one of the ironies of this opinion. It's not about any of that. Back in 2003, when the Lawrence v. Texas decision was decided, the brilliant Antonin Scalia predicted and said, this is all about promoting the homosexual agenda. And they do have an agenda. And I talked about how they set forth in the late 80s, early 90s to mainstream and normalize their conduct. And so this piece that Jonathan Last wrote in the Weekly Standard is all about the covert agenda that they really have, which is not about equality. It's about destroying, smashing the traditional family. And we talked about how some of them are pointing to the fact that even when they are married, and I'm making the air quotes right now, homosexual couples tend to not be monogamous. So this Slate's Hannah Rosen says, the dirty little secret about gay marriage, most gay couples are not monogamous. We have come to accept lately, partly thanks to Liza Mundy's excellent recent cover story in The Atlantic. And I think this is a woman who talked about how she still loved her husband, but she was kind of bored with their sex life, so they decided to have an open marriage. I think so. I'm not positive. And partly because we desperately need something to make the drooping institution of heterosexual marriage seem vibrant again, that gay marriage has something to teach us, that gay couples provide a model for marriages that are more egalitarian. Oh, that's what you call it? I wonder if Bill Clinton tried to sell that to Hillary. Honey, it's just I'm trying to be more egalitarian, and less burdened by old gender roles that are weighing marriage down these days. So, same-sex marriage is going to make your marriage better. I thought that, they kept telling you it doesn't affect your marriage. Oh, well, maybe that was one of those tools they were using. He also goes on to mention in the New Republic, there was a piece by a married lesbian who wrote about her quest to use her own brother's sperm to impregnate her wife. And the reason was, she says, quote, the queer parts of me relished the way it unsettled people, uprooting convention, collapsing categories, reframing and reassigning blood relations was a subversive wet dream, unquote. So wrote a married lesbian in the New Republic. And, of course, people who predicted back in 2003 when Lawrence v. Texas came out, a lot of us said, this opens the door to polygamy and a lot of other things. And people were saying, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. And even on Friday, you heard a lot of that. Well, how can that's got nothing to do with this? Well, not according to a lot of the advocates for so-called same-sex marriage. A lot of them admit that conservatives are right about that. And not only that, it's great. We should pursue these multi-partner relationships. And there's a whole organization called Beyond Marriage, the Beyond Marriage Movement. And they are eager to see marriages with many, many people in them. And, who knows, maybe other species as well. We don't want to be speciest in this whole thing, right? So this piece I will put in the show notes, but basically it reveals that most of the arguments that these folks have been making are just stealth, and they really are determined not only to smash traditional marriage, but remember what I start out with, to punish, as they punished the guy from Mozilla for taking any position opposed to so-called same-sex marriage. You may remember the case of Sweet Cakes by Melissa. Maybe you don't, but if I mention this and tell you more about it, you probably will. This was an Oregon bakery that was fined $135,000 because they would not bake a cake for a lesbian wedding. And, if I were in that business, I certainly would get out of it right now. And I wouldn't bake any wedding cakes for anybody. And, that's kind of a sad thing if you spent years building a business. Even if the government doesn't come after you or somebody doesn't sue you, you are going to be at a disadvantage, right? Because this is going to bring some new business for these businesses that cater to weddings, because there'll be these same-sex weddings. I think it's going to be pretty minuscule. I told you earlier in the program, it's not a large part of the population. However, regardless, if I were in that business, I'd get out of it right away. You also might remember the rest of the story in that Sweet Cakes by Melissa thing. That remember people who found out about this and felt very sorry for these folks, went and started a GoFundMe campaign for them. And gay activists actually pressured GoFundMe, which is a crowd-raising fundraiser place where you can go and donate, to remove the campaign. And we've just found out this month, and you may not have heard this, Mr. Last mentions this in his piece, that we now know, based on some documents released on June 1st, that these officials from this Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries, the ones who imposed this $135,000 fine on this business, that they were communicating through email, text messages, meetings, and giving and receiving of donations with this gay activist group that forced GoFundMe to get rid of this campaign to help people pay this fine. So, now that we have this constitutional right, so-called, which I think is just outrageous, totally invented out of nothing. We're going to talk about that in a second. And now that we know that the gay Gestapo is absolutely determined to punish anyone who disagrees with them, we have to be concerned about something that was raised in the oral arguments in this case when Justice Alito asked the counsel for the government, the Solicitor General, Donald Verrilli, was asked whether religious schools would have to embrace this whole idea of same-sex marriage or lose their tax-exempt status. What if you have a school and you have a dormitory for married students? Do you have to have two guys in that sharing a room? And the Solicitor General very honestly replied, I don't think I can answer that question. And he said, I don't deny that, Justice Alito. It is going to be an issue. And the majority, Anthony Kennedy, in this case, he just completely blew it off. Basically, nothing to see here. Don't worry about it. And that's absurd, given the determination of these people to punish. And you see, when you see that that's what it's all about, promoting this agenda and punishing anybody who disagrees with it, the truth really is revealed for all to see. And the truth is, it's not about live and let live. It's not about equality. It's about forcing people who don't approve of your behavior to say it's normal. And I got news for you guys in the gay Gestapo. I'm not ever going to say that. I don't think it's normal. I don't think two guys claiming to be married are married. I don't care what Anthony Kennedy says today, tomorrow, or ever. It doesn't matter to me. Now, I believe in live and let live. So you guys, knock yourselves out. But I'm just saying it's sad that people who run around and claim to be so proud, they're not proud. They don't have any self-esteem. Because if they did, they wouldn't need our approval for their behavior. And that's what this is all about. Now, let's get into the decision. I've got some random thoughts. I'll move my tablet over here. Random thoughts about the decision. I wanted to share a little bit about what Judge Scalia had to say about it. One thing that's very ironic in this whole decision is that the majority, as written by Anthony Kennedy's opinion, just like the left always does, they're using the children. Oh my God, it's for the children. And I have to tell you, I was very surprised and disappointed on Friday morning when this decision came down to see people on Fox Business Channel gushing over this decision, not the least of which was Andrew Napolitano, Judge Napolitano, but also on the panel there today, or Friday, was Cheryl Casoni, who is a correspondent there. She's a former flight attendant, for what that is worth. But she was gushing all about this decision and how wonderful it is for the children.
We're inclined to want to take this out of the legal arena, take it out of the political arena for a moment and personalize it. Because I think the president delivered a very personal and emotional response to this. And I think the gentleman right there, who's the plaintiff in this case, was, again, delivering a very personal point of view.
He talked about the death of his husband. He talked about the fact that this was something that he believed in. And you know, it's about love and family. And the president as well was talking about the children in all of this. How many children in this nation have same-sex parents? What about the victimization of those kids throughout the years? I mean, this is a very personal issue, and a lot of people are celebrating today that they finally feel that they have the dignity to live their lives the way that they want to live them.
Stuart Varney and Cheryl Casoni from Fox Business News on Friday, after the Supreme Court made so-called same-sex marriage a right in all 50 states, here on the Teri O'Brien Show. And as you heard there, they had just interviewed Jim Obergefell, who was one of the named plaintiffs in the case, talking about his husband and, you know, the love. And, you know, none of this had anything to do with the Constitution and the legal issues involved. But it was interesting to see Cheryl Casoni talk about the opinion where Judge Kennedy talked about how, you know, it's really terrible to have these children who have to grow up with unmarried parents. Since when? That's the irony of the whole thing. If in the late 60s and early 70s, people didn't start saying, oh, marriage is just a piece of paper, and eliminate the stigma from illegitimacy and say that it doesn't make any difference, we wouldn't be where we are today. It didn't make any difference then, and that's how we got to the place where marriage and the whole idea of mother and father raising their children in a committed union is destroyed, and that's the only way we could get to this point. And now to suggest that it's terrible for children to have unmarried parents of the same gender, I mean, it's so bizarre, it's impossible to get your head around at some level. Because really, the thing that's really best for children, as everybody knows, is to have a mother and a father. They each bring different things to a child's life. And so this is not about children. It's about adult desire and adults and how they, as Obama would say, you know, how and who they love. And my God, I don't want to think about how they love. Please get that image out of my brain. But this whole liberal thing to do the for the children, that is just beyond the pale, but very predictable. Second thing to remember about this case is that Anthony Kennedy has always been a goofball. He came from the Ninth Circuit, and he was the third choice after Ted Kennedy got rid of Bork. And Ed Meese tried to get another guy, Judge Ginsburg, but as I said, he had to reveal the fact that he had smoked dope while he was a college student, and so that put him out the window. But if you look, I will put in the show notes this New York Times liberal Death Star piece about Anthony Kennedy, but he is praised in here by people like Lawrence Tribe, who is a huge lib. So, I mean, he's always been a goofball. His opinions read like something out of Deep Thoughts from Saturday Night Live a lot of the time. So, you know, imagine, though, he was the third choice. Imagine if we had been able to get Judge Bork. It'd be a completely different result on a lot of different things. And, you know, this Lawrence v. Texas case and the Windsor case back a couple years ago, these cases paved the way for what we saw Friday. And it was very predictable. And I told you guys last fall, and this is my third takeaway, that not only did Windsor completely predict this, the case on the federal benefits for same-sex married couples who were married in states that allowed it, that completely predicted it. And that was the rationale that a lot of federal lower courts used to strike down state marriage laws against so-called same-sex marriage when they had no right to do that. But Scalia, in his dissent in Windsor, predicted that would happen. And sure enough, that's what happened. And that was the fact that the Supreme Court didn't slap down those rogue federal courts last fall. I mean, we all could see the handwriting on the wall, and I know you guys all could as well. And you probably know my fourth takeaway on the case was that Chief Justice Roberts actually read his opinion from the bench, and that showed how much he disagreed with it. And as you heard, a fifth takeaway you heard there from Cheryl Casoni and Stuart Varney, I've got more from her, she and Judge Napolitano. I hope we have time to hear them. But never underestimate the lack of seriousness in the coverage of a serious issue, because really this issue is not really about the policy, whether you oppose so-called same-sex marriage or think it's a good idea. I think it's a bad idea. But what I'm really upset about is the way this was done, through just basically judicial fiat by 5 liberal elitist lawyers with no basis in the Constitution whatsoever. Using a doctrine, the same doctrine they used in Roe v. Wade and the Dred Scott decision, this idea of substantive due process, which is basically just a way for judges to say, this is the way we think things should be, and so live with it. And it's completely just pulled out of a very dark place. And so that's the real problem. And that wasn't given enough coverage on any of the outlets that talked about it. Everybody talking about, whether it's a good idea or not. Most media outlets just gushing over how love wins. Love wins. I hope you follow my Twitter feed, because I did tweet out a page where all these gay Gestapo members were wishing for the death of Antonin Scalia. Because love wins, right? Also, a lot of the commentators cited the reason for supporting this as being that young people support it. Now, that's about the dumbest reason to support anything that I can imagine. How many dumb things did you support in your teens and 20s that you would be horrified to even consider supporting now? That's why the left wants young people, as many as possible, to vote, because they don't have the life experience and judgment to know when something's foolish or not. So, but we did hear a lot of this. We heard a lot of, young people, they're at the forefront of this. Wait, I thought we were told that these people have to stay on their parents' insurance till they're 26. Some of them, live at home till they're almost 30. And these are the people we're supposed to look to for judgment about how to conduct public policy and how to define an institution that has existed for 5,000 years and that is the fundamental building block of civilization? I don't think so. Also, 5 unelected Ivy League elitists cannot change the definition of marriage. Once again, it's like Roberts and the Obamacare thing. It's not affordable, it's not care, and it's not sustainable. It doesn't matter what he says, trying to save this law, which, is his predisposition to try to do. That's his judicial philosophy, to try to save laws passed by the legislature. We'll get into that more, I hope, later in the program. But, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. And we're going to have to see how this shakes out because, Congress still can act. We're going to have to see. It's going to be an issue in the presidential election, and I don't doubt that the commentators were correct, because I had the same thought. The most relieved people in the world with these decisions are the Republicans, both the Obamacare decision and the gay marriage decision, because they feel that's off the table. They don't have to talk about it. They can talk about what they would do about it, but they don't have to worry about fixing Obamacare before the election, which is something they did not want to do. And finally, another thought I had watching this decision was any Supreme Court case that has a bunch of people standing outside the court, screaming, blowing horns, waving banners, holding up their hand-lettered signs like it's some sort of a tailgate party outside a football game, shows us that the whole idea that the court is not political is a ridiculous charade. And I'm not saying that that's just something that happened yesterday. I know courts have been political for a while, but it's a sad thing to me to have to watch these people outside the court celebrating, dancing, and really none of them have the slightest clue that what they're celebrating is what Scalia called basically the destruction of our system, the end of our republic. Because if judges can just come along and it's not we the people, it's we the federal judges, then this country is not what the founders created. A republic, if you can keep it. And this is not the way we're going to keep it. That's why Scalia said a system of government that makes the people subordinate to a committee of 9 unelected lawyers does not deserve to be called a democracy. That's absolutely true. And he pointed out in his decision how these people on the court are basically just 9 liberal elitists. They all went to either Harvard or Yale Law School. None of them are from the middle of the country. And yet they claim to be able to decide a really important issue for over 300 million people, one that was working its way through the various states. But once again, just like in the case of abortion, the court feels the need to step in and use this heinous substantive due process crap to impose this on all of us. Okay. On the other side of the break, we are going to talk, you're actually going to hear my interview with Stanley Kurtz about this really bad regulation that the Obama regime is hoping to promulgate. And it will, if it is taken into effect, have the result of basically destroying the suburbs, which is something that the Obama regime has been dreaming of. They've been cooking this up for 5 years. They have deliberately kept it on the down low. And now it's getting a little bit of publicity. So we're going to tell you who's doing it, what it has done in some communities, and what you can do to stop it. And also a little bit more from Scalia, I hope, and the King v. Burwell decision. All that coming up here on the Teri O'Brien Show for June 28th, 2015.
You know the threat is real. You sit in meetings with advisors and operatives who tell you there could be Islamic sleeper cells in every major American community. You know the southern border is a welcome mat for terrorists to enter our towns and neighborhoods at will. You know about their plots to kill us in our shopping malls, our sports stadiums, and our office buildings. You won your office by talking like a champion of freedom. Now it's time to act like one. Pass a national right to carry law that guarantees my constitutional right to defend myself, my family, and my fellow Americans anywhere inside our borders. And make sure the enemies of freedom know the power of freedom. No law-abiding American should be forced to face evil with empty hands. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
Being a true American means more than just baseball, blue jeans, and rock and roll. Being an American also means taking responsibility. So if you're a man turning 18, do your part. Register with Selective Service. It keeps you eligible for college loans, government jobs, and job training. Plus, it's the law. To register, log on to www.sss.gov or pick up a Selective Service registration card at any post office. Be a man and register.
Who might you save?
Your mother, your father, your husband, uncle, aunt, son.
Learn FAST, F-A-S-T, the sudden signs of a stroke, and you could save
your friend, your best friend, teacher, boss, coach.
F, face drooping. A, arm weakness. S, speech difficulty. T, time to call 911. F-A-S-T, face, arm, speech, time. That's F, face drooping. A, arm weakness. S, speech difficulty. T, time to call 911. The sooner they get to the hospital, the sooner they'll get treatment. And that can make a remarkable difference in the recovery of
your neighbor, the waiter, a fellow shopper, a total stranger, grandmother, grandfather.
So learn FAST, the sudden signs of a stroke, then pass it on, because you never know who might save you.
Your wife, your colleague, teammate, mother.
Spot a stroke fast. Visit strokeassociation.org. Brought to you by the American Stroke Association and the Ad Council.
Green light. Hey girl, school zone. I'm getting hungry. Car changing lanes. You want to meet me for pizza? Stop sign. Intersection clear. Yeah, street. Pizza sounds good. Ball in street? Girl in street!
It's hard to concentrate on two things at once, like texting and driving. Stop the text, stop the wrecks. How will you stop texting and driving? Tell us at stoptextstoprex.org. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
There's a lot you're planning for in retirement, like spending more time with family.
Hi, Grandpa.
And fun adventures.
Oh, Bob, I can't believe we're finally in Hawaii.
But as you plan for retirement, remember Medicare doesn't cover dental. So it's important to floss, brush, and get regular dental checkups. Take care of your oral health. Or there's something you might not have when you retire. Your teeth. Oral health is essential to overall health. A message from AARP, Mighty Mouth, and WDS Foundation.
Psst, it's me, your heart. High blood pressure is serious, and I can quit whenever I want. Just treat me better. After all, we're in this together.
To get your high blood pressure to a healthy range, visit heart.org/blood pressure. A message from the American Heart Association and the Ad Council.
Let me try.
Okay, just remember what I showed you.
Yep. There was a bunny who had one big ear and another big ear. They looped-a-looped, made a bow, and the bunny hopped away. I did it!
Oh, good job, kiddo. Now let's tie your other shoe.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today. Learn more at 1-877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov.
Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Caution to liberals. You will find what you are about to hear extremely offensive, and repeated exposure to the Terry O'Brien Show may result in your being detoxed. Listen at your own risk.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U.
Here's what insightful and gifted writer Ginny DeAngelis of American Thinker and Breitbart fame says about Terry O'Brien's book, The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America. In the book, The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America, Teri O'Brien illustrates her brilliance. This lady uses sarcasm like a sword and cuts through the absurdity of America being forced to endure the A to Z disaster who, when he's not on vacation, lives in the White House. The well-researched information doesn't miss one iota of what's gone on for the past 6+ years. Teri weaves hard-hitting facts together with snarkiness and humor. You'll find yourself laughing. Then, as you're giggling, you'll begin to realize that what seemed comical is actually pathetic. Only from Teri could you get a statement like this. Election day, unemployment was 7.9%, which sounded bad to some people, but that didn't matter. It was no match for the awesome power of Barack Obama's radiant, loving energy and his amazing ability to care so much about people, especially the downtrodden, that they could literally feel his long arms warmly hugging them as they watched Judge Judy every afternoon. Read The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America. Trust me, learning the hard truth will be very entertaining. Another reviewer writes, "This book was great fun to read and was especially valuable for the links to news reports on each of the topics covered. The fun part stops when you realize what a cumulative disaster Obama's term in office has been. Much of it documented in this book. What say you? Get your copy of The ABCs of Barack Obama, Understanding God's Greatest Gift to America on Amazon.com today for the amazing price of only 99 cents. And let us know what you think by writing to abcs@terryobrien.com or posting your review on Amazon. Thank you for your encouragement and support.
Now I know my ABCs. Aren't you very proud of me?
She's America's original conservative warrior princess, daring to fearlessly and, more importantly, cheerfully commit.
We just want to say that we're not spirit bunnies anymore. We always hated that name. It bugged the heck out of Dina and me. It's just such a put down. Really? We know you've got a lot of spirit, everybody, right? And we're going to destroy Lincoln next week, all right? You know, it takes a lot of courage to get up here and do something that you know people will make fun of.
Ooh, what a girl. She's always in a whirl.
Always going new places, seeing new faces. That girl on the go.
Teri O'Brien.
Wonderful girl on the go.
Today's ruling from the Supreme Court affirms what millions across this country already know to be true in our hearts. Our love is equal.
It is.
That the 4 words etched onto the front of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, apply to us, too.
I want to play this music for Judge Kennedy because I mentioned a lot of his opinions sound like deep thoughts. And that's what this music reminds me of, like on Saturday Night Live, remember? And I'm looking at the article I mentioned from the liberal Death Star, the New York Times, describing the nomination of Judge Kennedy by Ronald Reagan back in November 1987. And he was the third choice, of course, after Judge Bork. And he says, Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard Law School professor and a liberal who has been a close advisor to Senator Biden, said in an interview that his initial impressions of Judge Kennedy were very favorable. Quote, his opinions are more sensitive than strident. He replaces the dogmatism of Robert Bork with a sense of decency and moderation. No, I think he replaces the intellectual rigor and knowledge of the Constitution of Robert Bork with a mush-headed, emotionally driven, worthless analysis that belongs in some kind of a greeting card. Anyway, we'll talk more about this. I want to share more about what Antonin Scalia had to say if we get into it, and mention briefly the Obamacare decision, although there's not a lot to say about that. And we do have some other news. I don't know how much we'll get to. But in the meantime, I did want to share with you my interview with Stanley Kurtz, who is the author of the terrific book, Spreading the Wealth, and we'll talk about that. But this is all about this whole idea, this new regulation proposed by HUD that is designed to destroy the suburbs. And Stanley wrote this book, and it came out right before the election, and he came on the program to talk about it. But now this thing is coming to the fore, and they're about to promulgate this thing, and it's really, really bad. If you worked hard to buy your own home in a nice suburb, you're going to want to pay close attention to my interview with Stanley Kurtz. So let's listen to the first part of that, and I'll be back on the other side. Introduce you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, I think we're recording now. And hey guys, I've been very fortunate in the past here on the Teri O'Brien Show, maybe 3 or 4. I think this is the 4th time we've been fortunate enough to have Stanley Kurtz class up our show. The last time was October 28th, 2012, right before the election, to talk about the essential book, his book, Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. If you haven't read it, shame on you. You need to read it. Yeah, you should have read it before the election, as we warned you. If you don't know about Stanley, you must not be a regular listener to the program or a regular reader of National Review Online, but he is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a contributing editor to National Review Online. Also, some people might say he has a little bit of the amazing Kreskin in him because so much of what he writes comes true. But I'm not always happy to see that happen, but it always does. Hey, Stanley, welcome to the program.
Teri, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you back again. Okay, so now last time you came on the show to talk about your book, Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. And you talked about this whole plan that they had. I'll let you just describe how the book opens, because everything you mention in this book is now coming true. You predicted it would come true in Obama's second term. But let's begin where you began this book, Spreading the Wealth. There was a meeting in the White House on July 18th, 2011, featuring a man named Mike Kruglich, and he has a group called Building One America. Now tell us about this meeting and why we should care.
Well, the book opened, as you say, Terry, with the story of Obama essentially inviting one of his old community organizing buddies, not just a buddy really, but a mentor of his, to the White House, along with the leaders of his group and a lot of members of his community organization. So this is just to show that Obama's community organizing days aren't over. And if you actually look at what the community organizers who trained Obama and worked with Obama were doing all those years, other than the stories that Obama tells in his book, Dreams from My Father, you find that their most important project, and very few people understand this, was an effort to, in a sense, get rid of the suburbs. Now, that doesn't mean dropping bombs on the suburbs and destroying them. It means that the community organizers who trained Barack Obama really didn't believe in suburbs. They wanted the cities to swallow up the suburbs, to literally annex the suburbs if possible. And if that proved to be impossible, to find ways to undercut the economic and political independence of America's suburbs, basically in order to grab hold of all that suburban tax money. So this is actually what the focus of Mike Kruglich's work was as he trained Barack Obama and worked with Obama through the years. And Obama and Kruglich never broke their connection. Most people have heard about Reverend Wright and they've heard about Bill Ayers, but they haven't really heard about this Mike Kruglich, who was one of the people who actually trained and mentored Obama. And all of the policies that Kruglich's group came up with in the old days and refined in current days are really becoming Obama administration policies, ways of pressuring people who live in suburbs to move back to cities, ways of moving people who live in cities now out to the suburbs, and ultimately of redistributing that suburban tax money to the cities. So you see, even if the boundaries of the suburbs remain technically present, if you start to push a lot of the people who live in suburbs into the cities and move a lot of people from cities out to suburbs and redistribute the money, in a sense, you've abolished the suburbs.
Yeah, and has this happened anywhere in America yet?
Well, there are a couple places that you could call the forerunners of all this. One is Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they have something called regional tax base sharing, where the suburbs around Minneapolis, St. Paul literally have to kick in their tax money into a giant regional pot, and then the money gets reallocated according to a mathematical formula that effectively makes a lot of that suburban tax money go to the city. And Minneapolis, St. Paul has got something called the Met Council. It's a kind of regional governing body which is able to, with the help of the Obama administration, channel federal transportation funding, federal housing funding, federal, even to some degree, perhaps federal education funding to the municipalities around. So it becomes a kind of super government. Again, it's almost as though the entire Twin Cities metropolitan area has been absorbed and annexed by the Twin Cities themselves. And so what Kruglich and the other community organizers who worked with Obama really want is for that Minneapolis-St. Paul model to be exported to the rest of the country. And we see something like that happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. And all of this is happening in part because of state laws and the activism of these community organizations, but very much also because the Obama administration has been working hand in glove with the community organizations in these areas. And what this new rule, affirmatively furthering fair housing, that the Obama administration is getting ready to promulgate in its final form would do is make it a lot easier for the federal government to essentially force cities and suburbs all around the country into this model that we see in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and San Francisco Bay, where in effect, slowly but surely, in a kind of frog boiling way, the suburbs get swallowed up and controlled by the cities, and you get a kind of regional government. So instead of being governed by the elected officials in the municipality where you happen to live, you're governed by these regional officials who very often aren't even elected, but rather are appointed by bureaucrats who favor this regionalist view.
Did the people in Eden Prairie and some of those other suburbs around Minneapolis consent to this? Did they know it was happening? How did this happen to them? It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that they would willingly go along with.
Well, it happened because it was forced on them by the state government. Now, technically, the Constitution delegates all the powers that it doesn't give to the federal government to the states. Of course, the tradition in America is that we have levels in our federalist system. We have the local level, and then we have the state level, and then we have the national level. But technically, the state, if it so chose, could come into any city, any suburb, any municipality, and essentially tell it what to do. And so at a certain point in its history, Minnesota, which is already a liberal-leaning state, went through several sessions, it took maybe 3 or 4 legislative sessions to finally pass this, and they did it by the skin of their teeth and over strong objections from many, many suburbs. But they finally managed to pass this regional tax-based sharing legislation. So that has to come through the state. But a lot of these housing policies and transportation policies and education policies that go along with this whole regionalist philosophy can be imposed by the federal government. And this new regulation, affirmatively furthering fair housing, is a great example of how that's all going to take place.
Now, the folks in Westchester County, New York, have had their battle that you describe in the book, Spreading the Wealth. And if you are just joining us, we're talking to Stanley Kurtz, who is the author of not only Spreading the Wealth, how Obama is robbing the cities to pay, the suburbs to pay for the cities. And of course, this book will be in the show notes. Definitely recommend you get this book and Radical in Chief, which is an essential read if you want to understand Barack Obama. But you describe in Spreading the Wealth that folks in Westchester County are fighting this whole thing. How is that going down?
Well, there was a civil rights group in New York State filed a suit against Westchester County, well-to-do suburban county outside of New York City. This, by the way, is where Bill and Hillary Clinton live. And every time any locality in the country gets a federal grant, the most popular are called Community Development Block Grants, they have to sign a little form that says, we agree to affirmatively further fair housing. And what that has traditionally meant was we agree to aggressively monitor to make sure that there's no actual discrimination against people because of their race or ethnicity. But according to this suit, you had to do more than that. It's almost like a principle of affirmative action for housing. It wasn't good enough just to say that there's no housing discrimination in Westchester County. Actually, no one has ever accused Westchester County of discriminating against people who come in and try to buy a home. Instead, they said that this obligation to affirmatively further fair housing forces you, if you don't already have integrated housing, even if it's because people just maybe can't afford to live in your area, you've got to go out and, at the expense of the locality, build high-density, low-income housing, and then go out and advertise it in poor and minority communities. And this is unheard of. This is something where it's not the traditional American dream where you scrimp and you save and you work hard for years to, as the middle class does, to save up its money and buy that dream home that you always wanted to have with a freestanding yard where you can raise your kids. Instead, they're basically short-circuiting all that and saying, we order you to housing, this low-income housing, at your own expense, not because there's any evidence of discrimination, but we just don't like the fact that people can't afford to live in your neighborhood. And so this suit was pressed by a civil rights organization, and then Westchester County, which at that time was a Democratic-leaning county, very liberal area. Again, Bill and Hillary lived there. They went to the Obama administration thinking that the Obama administration would create a reasonable middle ground kind of a settlement. And it turns out the Obama administration instead jumped on this opportunity to, again, force Westchester County at its own expense to build this high-density, low-income housing in violation of its own zoning regulations. Essentially, it was as if the federal government was taking over the local government in Westchester County. And very interestingly, from a political perspective, at that point, the county government flipped, and they elected a Republican named Robert Astorino, and he has been fighting ever since against the federal government. And this new regulation the Obama administration has, affirmatively furthering fair housing, essentially it's going to give the federal government a tool to do to every suburb in the country what they're already doing to Westchester County.
Oh, man. Well, now, on June 15th in National Review, you wrote a piece, and you write about this. You've been writing about this for the last 2 years since this preliminary rule affirmatively furthering fair housing came out. And, of course, you predicted it all in the book Spreading the Wealth. But on June 15th, you wrote, you posed a really interesting question. You know, you mentioned this is a radical transformation. What you just described is social engineering, you know, the federal government taking over local zoning. It's ridiculous. But you say, like, how does this escape any scrutiny? And you point out you've actually discovered a video of some sort of seminar at the Brookings Institution called Place Opportunity and Social Mobility, What's Now for Policy, and that was held June 1st, where effectively these folks that are promoting this admit that they have to work behind the scenes. They have to keep this on the down low because people are not going to want this. Tell us about, like, how did you discover this and what does it really say? Who are the folks involved?
Well, the Brookings Institution is filled with people who believe in this regionalist philosophy. They want to undercut the powers of local government and essentially replace them with regional governments, which, as I said before, kind of amounts to almost having the cities annex their surrounding suburbs. And the experts on all of this at Brookings are very close to the Obama administration. They've recommended a lot of the people who now stock the departments of housing and urban development and other cabinet departments in the Obama administration, all of them adhering to this regionalist philosophy. And it was fascinating then to see this seminar held at Brookings, which they told us at the beginning of the seminar was being watched by, I think, 30 officials in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in the middle of this, someone talked about how transformative this new rule, affirmatively furthering fair housing, would be. And they made the remark that people, you know, the name sounds obscure and people don't understand how transformative this really is. And then the host of the session said, well, maybe it's good that this remain obscure. Politically speaking, we need it to remain obscure. And it's really fascinating to see that while he's been pursuing these policies for the entirety of his administration, and I wrote a book about it, you know, about 3 years ago, but Obama never mentions this issue, not in his State of the Union address, not at a general press conference. The White House is not putting out press releases bragging about all of this. It's really kept remarkably quiet because, honestly, this whole move toward regionalism and this regulation affirmatively furthering fair housing is just as transformative as the people at Brookings were claiming. I think you'd have to say it just about equals Obamacare in its transformative potential. And yet, can you imagine someone trying to do something like Obamacare without saying anything to anyone? And we already know that we didn't, you know, the bill wasn't read, Obamacare, before it passed. But what about, you know, doing something and not telling anyone about it? Of course, it's public, and they promulgated this rule. But another interesting thing is not only does the Obama administration not hype this, but the press doesn't cover it.
Right. That's what you point out in this piece from June 15th on National Review. You point out, and we'll talk about what Arizona Congressman Gosar is trying to do. And last week, an amendment passed in the House to try to defund this crazy rule that they want. But Mia Love, the first African-American Republican woman in the House, apparently was very aggressive in questioning the HUD Secretary, Julian Castro. You'd think, if the shoe were on the other foot, if it were a Democrat African-American Congresswoman questioning a Republican administration's HUD Secretary, that would have probably been the lead story. This was completely buried. You didn't see it anywhere except in your column. I saw it nowhere else.
That's right. It was buried. Well, there was a very small squib on it in the Hill, but they have to report on what goes on Capitol Hill. But if you look at the major networks, if you look at all of the big papers, there's nothing about it. And you've got this rule coming out. You've had the Republicans, as you mentioned, Congressman Gosar was able to pass an amendment in the House choking off any funding to enforce this affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation. Julian Castro is on everyone's lips as the most likely vice presidential pick for Hillary Clinton. So how is this not news? And yet it's not covered. And why is it not covered? I think because the press understands and sympathizes with the Obama administration's desire to keep this quiet. They really are acting as political operatives, the press, rather than as newsmen.
How stunning is that, huh? Hey, in this Brookings event, did you say that the people in the White House were watching a live stream of this Brookings event where they talked about being stealthy?
The people at HUD were watching, and one of the things I said in my post was, the fact that this fellow at Brookings could make this remark, knowing, as he himself had bragged at the beginning of the event, that 30 people at HUD were watching, 30 officials of the government, and yet he wasn't embarrassed to say this. You could almost say he was giving advice to them on how to keep it quiet.
Well, not only that, but this Emily Badger from the Washington Post was there. She's supposed to be a reporter.
That's right. And of course, if it was just a single reporter who was, taking a position and there were others who had alternative positions, or if people at least covered it in a reasonably fair way, and yet you've got this transformative rule, and at this session at Brookings, it was said that it's going to be a big deal and transformative, and yet the news media is not covering it. So it really is an extraordinary thing. And now you've had this very, very important and troubling decision by the Supreme Court yesterday earlier this week on disparate impact housing regulations.
Yeah, let me just set that up before you explain it. Yeah, the case is Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project. Isn't that a beautiful name? Involving the Fair Housing Act. And yeah, some people think it's worse than Obamacare because, in this opinion, Anthony Kennedy, and he was the third choice. I wish we could have had Robert Bork. But he talks about how there's unconscious racism. So give me your take, though, on this disparate impact decision that came down from the court.
Well, with the original intention of the Fair Housing Act, of 1968 was to prevent housing discrimination. It was not to authorize a kind of affirmative action in housing where you go out and say, I've surveyed this neighborhood. It's got X number of people of these races and of these ethnicities, and I don't like that mix. Let's change that mix. That's very different. That kind of social engineering is very different than simply saying, look, if someone comes to buy a house, then you can't discriminate against them based on their ethnicity or their race. That was the real intention. But somehow the courts and housing advocates and the Obama administration have pushed and pushed and pushed to have this much more expansive interpretation called disparate impact, which basically says you don't have to mean to discriminate, but if your policy, which treats everyone in a completely neutral way. Let's say that someone says, I don't want to rent to anyone who has a record of being a drug addict. And that goes for whites, blacks, Hispanics, doesn't matter. And they apply that in a completely neutral way. But if you show that statistically one particular group or ethnicity falls more into that than another, well, then that landlord might be liable to a suit for what's called disparate impact. So it doesn't matter if you're doing something without regard to race. You can be brought up on charges, so to speak, regardless. And what Justice Kennedy did was to authorize that. Now, if Justice Kennedy had said, no, we're going back to what I think reasonable people say was the true original intention of the Fair Housing Law, then this whole regulation of affirmatively furthering fair housing would have probably eventually been thrown out in court, because the entire principle of the Obama administration's transformative affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation is based on this idea of disparate impact. So not only has the Supreme Court now said, in effect, go ahead, issue that regulation, but they've handed a hugely important tool to all of these civil rights groups. Remember, I said that in Westchester County, all of the pressure from the Obama administration on the county was initiated by a lawsuit by a civil rights organization, and that was basically saying, Westchester, you promised to affirmatively further fair housing and you're not doing it. Well, now that they've got this hugely expansive interpretation of affirmatively furthering fair housing that basically means you've got to have a community that looks just the way we want it to look. Now that that's happening, then this new regulation is going to be able to not only say, if you don't knuckle down and do what the federal government wants, we're going to cut off your federal money, but now on top of that, some of these groups can go to the courts and try to sue the municipalities. And by the way, the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation is going to channel federal money to those community groups. So it's going to make it easier for them to afford to be able to go to court. So the the suburbs are going to be caught in a squeeze between the Obama administration's threat to cut off their money if they don't change the whole structure of their municipality, but also they're going to knuckle under because they're afraid of a lawsuit.
Oh, man. Well, and of course, in his brilliant dissent, Justice Thomas said we need to get rid of this whole disparate impact thing altogether. It was never intended by Congress. But some are pointing out that this Texas housing decision, as bad as it is and as awful as the statements by Kennedy about the unconscious racism and, give me a break there. But they are pointing out the court did place limits. They did say you can't bring a claim solely on disparate impact. You have to show that the defendant's policy actually caused the disparity. Now, I know you're going to say to me, Sam, you're going to say that's not going to be hard to do for these groups, and I think you're probably right.
Right. I don't have a lot of confidence, not only because the terms that were set by Justice Kennedy probably can be gotten around, but even if you make the argument, which can really be made, that, well, maybe some of those terms would disallow the worst of what the Obama administration wants to do. Even if you could say that, I frankly just don't believe that Justice Kennedy, when push comes to shove, is going to make that decision. You might remember that Justice Kennedy, I think when he decided Lawrence v. Texas on the issue of same-sex relations, tried to make a distinction between what he was doing there and saying that there's a right to same-sex marriage. He was sending out a message that just because he had decided Lawrence v. Texas a certain way didn't mean he was going to find a right to same-sex marriage. And what has the court just done? It's found a right to same-sex marriage. I think by the time a case works its way back up to the court, Justice Kennedy is going to get weak in the knees again and basically say, well, I don't want to take the personal responsibility of getting the whole mainstream media and the liberal establishment mad at me. So I'm going to find another way to kind of wiggle out of it and create one of these vague decisions based on nothing, which doesn't really stop any of the practices that are going on. That's why I think the only way to really fight this is to win the next presidential election. That's going to tell the tale on this and many other issues, because if Hillary Clinton gets in and if Julian Castro is her vice president, but even if he's not, but certainly if he is, I think you're going to see that this affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation is going to take root, and it's going to start to really cut against the wishes of local governments across the country. But if a Republican comes in, it's going to be a very different situation. So to me, this is going to be have to be fought out as a presidential campaign issue. I don't know whether the Republicans will have the courage to make it into an issue, but I have noticed in the last few weeks since the Gosar Amendment and some of the blogging that has been going on that there have been, for the first time, op-eds in major outlets by conservatives and Republicans saying we do have to make this affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation into a national issue.
More from Stanley coming right up here on the Teri O'Brien Show.
Ms. O'Brien. O'Brien.
She's about as hard right and at least, if not more, articulate than Limbaugh.
Well, she's popular. There's something about this bitch that's really spectacular.
Yeah, for a popular girl, she's pretty popular.
She's about being sensible.
Well, she can make them talk about themselves, the way it says girls should do in those teenage columns.
Know-it-all, bitch. Basically, I'm in love with her. Enough! Blah!
What it does do is that it does give us certainty as we go forward with complaints that we can fully use this tool of disparate impact, and we will use it. And I believe that in using it, we're going to help ensure that more people of different backgrounds have the kind of housing opportunity that they ought to have in America.
Julian Castro mentioned there in the interview with Stanley Kurtz of National Review here on the Teri O'Brien Show from just this morning on C-SPAN. So they are pushing this and pushing it hard, and we'll get to hear more from Stanley, and I want to talk a little bit more about that June 1st event that he mentioned. But first, I want to share a little idiocy from Sunday shows. And when you say idiocy, of course, you're talking Chuck Todd, right? Okay, so two of these bites I'm about to share with you do come from Chuck Todd. One of them is right at the beginning of his interview with Bobby Jindal, who has announced that he is running for president. You know, he is the governor of Louisiana. And he came on the program, and before he came on, they showed a little video of his kids, his wife and kids and him in the backyard. And his telling them, you know, I'm going to run for president again, and you guys get to go to Iowa again, and you guys like Iowa. And they said, oh, yeah, we love Iowa. And so that's what's referred to in this bite.
Interestingly, Jindal and Christie do have something in common. They're both one-time rising stars of the party who are getting hit hard in their own states, and they'll both be hoping somehow to turn their problems in their backyards into advantages to show that they have the conviction to lead, even if unpopular, on the national stage. I'm joined now by the governor of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal. Welcome back to Meet the Press, Governor.
Chuck, thank you for having me. Of course my kids love Iowa. They know of Iowa. They went to the Iowa State Fair. They had a deep-fried candy bar. Who wouldn't love that?
There you go. Pander, pander, pander away.
NBC's Chuck Todd from this morning's edition of Meet the Press. That's a different show. I think that's when they're working on for Bill Clinton over at MSNBC. No, Chuck Todd from NBC's Meet the Press from this morning here on the Teri O'Brien Show. Pander, pander, pander. Can you imagine Chuck Todd ever speaking to a Democrat candidate like that? Ever? I mean, it's outrageous. And, you know, it's never going to change. Is it too late to get Jon Stewart back? Oh, and he mentioned in the open to that, he mentioned something about Chris Christie. And I did want to mention, since we have been talking about this affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation with Stanley Kurtz, that Governor Christie in New Jersey has authorized one of those regionalist boards that we were talking about that is so very dangerous, that is the key to these groups getting their foot in the door. Chris Christie, and I hope he's going to be asked about this because he is actually signed on to this whole idea. I'm trying to find the piece here, but I just read about the fact that he had authorized that. So that's kind of troubling. And I do think that this whole regulation needs to have a light shined on it. And I think that we need to make it an issue because, as he points out, as Stanley Kurtz points out, if Hillary Clinton becomes president or any Democrat and this whole thing comes to pass and they push it really hard, it can be really, really dangerous. Yeah, it's in this piece from a group, let's see, the Celius Foundation for Public Research Policy had a piece on this on October 5th, 2012. So I don't know how far this has gone with Governor Christie, but he recently, and this would have been in October 2012, announced the formation of a regional planning document called the State Strategic Plan. And so it goes along with this whole idea of building in cities, reigning in suburbs. So, the whole idea to destroy the suburbs, to prohibit what they like to call sprawl, but basically prohibit building out farther from the cities. And that's what this is about. So Governor Christie, I think, needs to be asked about this. But anyway, we'll get more into that. Now, more idiocy, though, from Meet the Press this morning, because on the panel today, because of course they had to talk about the Confederate flag, because we haven't talked about that enough, have we? So they had Charles Ogletree, who is a professor of law, I think still at Harvard, but he's a very racialist sort of guy, kind of in the mold of Eric Holder. And he was on the panel, and they were talking about the Supreme Court decision on so-called same-sex marriage when he had the following exchange with Chuck Todd.
How do you feel about this idea that the Supreme Court should reflect public opinion?
I think the Supreme Court does not reflect public opinion. I think they're deciding what's the law and what's justice, what's equality. And if you take a peer vote, we're going to lose every time. We're a minority. African Americans, people, Asian Americans, people who are Latinos and Latinas. But the Supreme Court says we can decide what the law is going to be, and I rest and say that they have made a good decision, a good series of decisions on Obamacare, on other issues as well.
Charles Ogletree, Harvard Law professor, racialist, from this morning's edition of NBC's Meet the Press here on the Teri O'Brien Show. So, yeah, minorities never win. You see, that's why they have to have the courts come in and basically rule by fiat, an imperial judiciary, 5 elitists in black robes telling us what is and isn't the way it's going to be, because otherwise the rights of minorities would just be trampled. So if minorities never win, Professor Ogletree, can you explain how Obama got elected? Because in 2008, last time I checked, was still a majority white country. So what the heck happened there? I guess that's a little bit of a dent in your theory. I'll be right back.
Which makes me think of a story. Everything makes me think of a story. About 3 dogs, an American dog and a Polish dog and a Russian dog. They were all having a visit, and the American dog was telling them about how things were in this country. He said, you bark, and you bark long enough, and then somebody comes along and gives you some meat. And the Polish dog said, "What's meat?" The Russian dog says, "What's bark?"
If you're in an argument with somebody and they're older than you, you should listen to them. It doesn't mean they're right. It means that even if they're wrong, their wrongness is rooted in more information than you have.
comedian Louis C.K. explaining why, life experience is a good thing. And that's what some of the people who are praising this same-sex marriage decision, because young people like it, should remember. Okay, I want to let you hear more from Stanley Kurtz, because he has been very prescient, not just on this issue of housing, but also about marriage, which we did talk about. Guys, we're talking to Stanley Kurtz, the always insightful, and in a minute, you're going to find out how insightful based on something he just said, but so many things he says are insightful, and you need to read Spreading the Wealth, and you need to read Radical in Chief, and links to those books will be in the show notes. Please get them. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We've got to bang the pots and pans, and that's one reason, Stanley, I wanted you to come on and talk about the Gosar Amendment, because isn't it going to the Senate now, and shouldn't we be agitating about that?
Well, we should, and I'm myself waiting for more information about whether there might be a Senate sponsor and what the timing of it is. But, well, I definitely think that your listeners ought to be writing to their senators and asking them to support the Gosar Amendment when it arrives in the Senate. I am quite concerned about the situation, because it's possible that Harry Reid and the Democrats will block regular voting on any specific bill and just go back and pass this cromnibus, this continuing resolution, which just sort of continues all of the current funding of the government without getting into specific bills, as a way of fighting the kind of brakes that the Republican Congress could put on some of the worst abuses of the Obama administration. The Democrats might manage to pull that off. I'm not saying it's going to happen for sure. I still think it's very much worth pressing your senators to vote in favor of the Gosar Amendment, but it's very far from a guarantee. And now that the Supreme Court has effectively given a green light and almost a turbocharging to this affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, I think the political momentum is on the side of the Obama administration, and while I don't think it's impossible to stop, I think that this regulation could well come out very soon.
Oh, man. Well, I think we got to, and hey, people in Nevada, Harry, you could get to Harry Reid, right? Is he running again? Is he running again? I think he is.
Oh, I think he announced, I think he announced that he was not running again.
Not running, no. He wants the Attorney General of Nevada to take his seat, the Democrat. So, let's let it be known, folks in Nevada, that we are very concerned about this regulation, and that we're not going to be predisposed to vote for Democrats if this is treated in the way that Stanley just described. Now, I told you before you came on the air, though, I wanted to talk to you about your prescient comments and commentary on the issue of marriage. You just mentioned you don't have a lot of confidence in the fact that even though this disparate impact thing has a few breaks on it, that, it's not a complete victory for these housing groups. You said, you're with me. You don't really agree that it's really going to be stopped by the breaks that are in there. And that makes me think of something you wrote back in May of 2004 in National Review. And it's called Marriage Mayhem. I'll put it in the show notes. Basically, what this is all about, though, was when the Supreme Court of Massachusetts made their decision legalizing same-sex marriage, they specifically put in a residency requirement. And that was supposed to be, okay, we're not going to allow any marriages of people that come here from states that don't allow same-sex marriage. And how long did it take before that turned into, well, we can't allow, that used to be used to not let people marry interracially. We can't, and it took about a month, didn't it, for that to go by the wayside?
Right. One of the arguments that was before the court in the decision that they just made nationalizing same-sex marriage was precisely this idea that it wouldn't be fair to couples who couldn't be confident that their marriage would be recognized in states that did not have same-sex marriage. So, I mean, it's I guess it's called comfort, but almost everything that opponents of same-sex marriage were concerned about. I mean, there was a time, by the way, when proponents of same-sex marriage reassured opponents again and again that a federal marriage amendment wasn't necessary because the Defense of Marriage Act is perfectly sufficient to allow the states to be able to decide on their own. And so, none of that was believable at the time, and it isn't believable now. And I just saw at Politico today had an interesting article coming out on essentially the same day as the marriage decision, saying that now's the time to support polygamy. And all of you folks, all of you liberals who supported same-sex marriage but opposed polygamy, I know you were doing that, this article was saying, not because you really were against polygamy, but just because it was the practical thing to do to counter the slippery slope arguments of conservatives. But now that same-sex marriage is legal, let's go with polygamy. And I think that's just the beginning of what we're going to see now that we've got same-sex marriage. It doesn't stop there.
Well, you predicted this 12 years ago. I'm looking at a piece of yours from Weekly Standard in August 2003, The Road to Polyamory, whatever the hell that is. And at the end, though, you say very brilliantly, the very last line, what lies beyond gay marriage is no marriage at all. Now, Stanley, I always say, though, that none of this would have been possible if heterosexuals hadn't destroyed marriage in the first place. In the late 60s and early 70s, we're running around saying, oh, it's just a piece of paper, and what difference? And they start shacking up and popping out all the illegitimate kids. And so, of course, what difference does it make, as Hillary would say?
Sure, I think there's a lot to that argument. I mean, I've always believed that while the institution of marriage was badly damaged by the 60s, that there was enough left there was enough strength to it, that it was worth trying to draw some lines and preserve it. But it was always a good argument to say that once we went through the radical changes of the 60s, in a sense, it was all lost from there. I guess that can be argued. As you yourself said earlier, and we'll never really know how this all would have worked out. But what if Bob Bork, had squeaked through and gotten on that court? These decisions are so close. It's possible to imagine other alternatives, but of course it's equally possible to imagine that the underlying social changes that have driven this issue would have happened anyway, and in the end that they would have controlled. So no one can really know the answer to those questions. But right now, I'm not optimistic about the future of the institution of marriage.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know that this isn't really necessarily right in your wheelhouse, but do you have any thought as to why Elena Kagan and Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't recuse themselves from this gay marriage case?
I've heard tangentially about that controversy, but I haven't followed it closely. But obviously, I think they're committed to the result that they were looking for here, and they weren't about to recuse themselves unless forced to do so.
And they can't be forced. So, end of story. And that's the left for you, right? The ends justify the means. Well, I've kept you much longer than I told you I was going to keep you here, Stanley, but I really enjoyed talking to you. And frankly, the last couple of days have been kind of depressing. So I kind of wanted to talk to a like-minded friend. And although I have to tell you, you haven't really given me a lot of optimism here today. I mean, and especially when you start saying you're not optimistic, it's bad because as I've been telling you and the audience over the last 12 years, all the stuff you've been saying has come true, and none of it has been good. So,
well, there's one issue on which I am optimistic that I'm working on that maybe I can speak with you another time on the battle over the teaching of American history in the schools, and ultimately the education battle as a whole. I can see a pretty positive resolution of that, not as a certainty, but as a real possibility, and maybe that could help to make long-term cultural change. So that's optimism, which I genuinely feel, and maybe we can talk about that sometime.
Are you working on another book?
No, but I've been fighting very hard a battle over the teaching of AP US history, and more broadly the teaching of American history in the schools. And it's really become terrible because of certain changes made by the College Board, the company that runs the SAT test and all the advanced placement programs. But what we're trying to do is to create perhaps an alternative company, an alternative testing company that would give states and school districts that were so inclined the option of a more traditional kind of teaching. And if that took root, then you'd see new textbooks written by the kind of great scholars that don't get a chance under the current liberally dominated culture to write. And you could almost see what you might call a red state curriculum developing. It wouldn't be able to sweep the whole country, but it would sweep the red parts of the country. This is the optimistic scenario, and I believe that it's possible, and that's something that could create broader cultural change.
Oh, I'd love to see that. Well, I have so many friends who are homeschooling or have homeschooled, and just for that reason. So, I mean, I think that is definitely, and I would love to have you back because, you know, you love to come back, right? This is like your fourth time, so it's awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you guys there have better weather than we have. Our biggest challenge lately is figuring out when to mow our lawns in between torrential rain. So, I don't know what's up with that. I mean, I know the people in California would envy us a lot, but
send it to California.
Yeah, definitely. Stanley, thanks so much for joining me today. And then we talked a few more minutes off the air. That was my friend Stanley Kurtz. Amazing, his predictions about marriage. And all the articles I referred to will be in the show notes at terryobrien.com. Okay, so it doesn't look like we've got a lot of time left for me to talk about any of Scalia's great quotes. I will put some of them in the show notes at terryobrien.com. Don't forget, on Wednesday evening, we have the Machete of Truth program here on Informed America Radio, and he's doing a 3-part series on the Kennedy assassination. So you do not want to miss that. Wednesday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. So go to Spreaker.com. You can listen there. Also, we have 3 more Supreme Court cases coming down tomorrow. An Arizona redistricting case, a case on the Clean Air Act, and a case on the Oklahoma lethal injection. So we'll be watching all of those. And Tuesday is the self-imposed Iranian nuclear deal deadline. That's going to come and go. It's interesting. They're not allowing any videotape of Lurch as he's being airlifted in and out of his airplane, you know, shades of FDR. And we also have the mystery of the 15 missing Hillary Clinton, Sid Vicious, a.k.a. Sid Blumenthal emails that we need to figure out what happened there. We'll be following that during the week. So don't forget to join me during the week at terryobrien.com. Thanks so much to those of you who have stopped by there and dropped a few pennies in the tip jar. You're the only reason that we're still here. We'll be back here next week, of course, July 5th. I don't know where the first half of the year went, but don't forget to start your Amazon shopping there. Thanks to producer Thomas. Thanks to the Canine associate producers. Remember, stay tough because only the strong can stay free.